I'm going to do a review of the History Channel's show on Sun Tzu, The Art of War. Overall, I thought it was a pretty good show, but I thought they made some errors in that show, and I'd like to talk to you about that. You know, they talked about they talked about Robert E. Lee screwing up at Gettysburg and the mistakes that he made at that. And in that, Shinjin talks about you want to find the enemy, find their dispositions, get good military intelligence on them, and then pick the spot of battle and the time of battle where you have the greatest advantage, where you can win. And they said Lee at Gettysburg didn't do that. His cavalry forces failed him, his reconnaissance force failed him, and his officers failed him because they didn't obey his orders not to engage the enemy till they're all together at the right time and place to pick the battle. You know, the whole idea of you want to choose the time and place of battle to your advantage rather than blundering into a battle and then trying to seek victory after you've blundered into a battle you didn't want at a time and a place you didn't want. Well, that happens a lot in the military. You know, it's ideal if you can choose the time and place and not engage the enemy until you're ready and on your own terms to where you have the maximum advantage. But a lot of times you just blunder into each other, they start fighting, and then that fighting starts to accelerate where other units get involved. And the thing is Sun Tzu, The Art of War, it was a guideline on how to do things, and it wasn't an absolute. But, you know, it's interesting because I think if Sun Tzu was at the Battle of Gettysburg and this battle had started, he would have seen the same opportunity that Robert E. Lee saw, that he could win. If he could win this battle, he could win the entire war at this point. I think if Lee had won at Gettysburg, the Union would have sued for peace and allowed the Confederacy to secede from the Union, and that's probably what would have happened at that point, because they were pretty sick of the North was pretty sick of the war at that point. But the thing was that I think if Stonewall Jackson and his men were at the Battle of Gettysburg, particularly at least arrived early on the second day, that they would have seized the ground at Little Round Top, and they would have had the tactical advantage, and they would have won that battle, and thus probably the entire war. But that was the thing. It was in warfare. A lot of times, you know, people do just you just do blunder into each other, and battles start, and you just have to deal with the situation. And ideally, you want to, as Sun Tzu says, you want to. The real acronym of skill is not fighting 100 battles and winning, but to win without having to go to battle. Napoleon, when he fought the Italians in northern Italy during the Napoleonic Wars, he actually maneuvered his troops into such a position that he was able to force the Italian army to surrender without actually hardly having to fire a shot the entire battle. So he was able to outmaneuver them and have them surrender to him without actually really having to physically destroy them. And that was, you know, Sun Tzu would have applauded for that. And it's great when it can happen. It's great when you can do it. But even Sun Tzu himself, who fought in many battles, a lot of times he wasn't able to do that himself. You know, I'm not criticizing Sun Tzu as being an incompetent military commander. He wasn't. The man was absolutely brilliant. And but the thing is sometimes, even for himself, I'm sure things didn't work the way he wanted to work, or work according to the precepts that he advised people to try and engage in. Sometimes, you know, events happen and you just have to deal with them the best that you can. You know, it's interesting where in that show they talk about you know, the whole go strategy as opposed to the whole attrition strategy of military warfare. Go being where you're just trying to grab area, and an attrition strategy like chess where you're trying to physically destroy your enemy in a battle of attrition against them. And I think that if you look at warfare, you look at the history of warfare, I mean, sometimes you can win with a go strategy, but sometimes you have to engage in attrition strategy, and each war is different. You know, where they criticized in Vietnam, they said that the enemy was engaging in a go strategy. Well, what they were really, they're trying to take territory without necessarily closing with the enemy and fighting battles. But basically the Vietnamese strategy was really one of wearing down the will of the American people to continue fighting this war to where we would throw in the towel, and that actually worked really quite well. That was what happened. The Tet Offensive was an interesting anomaly because it was actually, the battle was an American victory. We hammered the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong very well in that. We really clobbered them. But the thing was we lost the political war. In that, when the American public saw the Tet Offensive on TV, and they realized that this war could just go on and on and on and on and on. And we decided we didn't want to fight in Vietnam anymore. The American public had no more stomach for it, and they essentially lost the battle of the Tet Offensive, but they won the political battle at home, and we were willing to throw in the towel. So that was kind of an interesting anomaly there. They criticized, it was interesting because in the show, they talked about the importance of moral authority in war, and that the Vietnamese lost that, the NVA lost that moral authority when they were shooting civilians who were like school teachers and bureaucrats and stuff like that. And it didn't, because of that, the general population didn't rise up and join them. The general population didn't rise up and join them basically because most people would rather safely sit on the sidelines rather than risk their lives and put themselves in harm's way if they don't have to. And they'll settle for whoever ends up being their new masters between, this forced fight between the North and the South. They're sitting on the sidelines because most people do sit on the sidelines if they can and not put themselves in danger if they don't have to. That was the reason they were sitting on the sidelines. It wasn't because they shot these bureaucrats and school teachers and civilians. Now that was a bad move on the NVA's part. It was an unnecessary move, but at the same time, it didn't really backfire on them that badly. That wasn't the reason why the general population didn't join them. The general population didn't join them because they really just wanted to safely sit on the sidelines and not put themselves in harm's way, which most people will sit on the sidelines and do that if they are given the choice. They talked about. I felt they were really too harsh on. Like I said, I felt they were really too harsh on Lee at the Battle of Gettysburg, ignoring Sun Tzu's principles. He wasn't really ignoring them. His cavalry commanders and his officers basically ignored his orders and didn't do the proper screening and give him the proper intelligence that he needed on that day of that battle. And part of the problem was he had lost a lot of his best officers, like Stonewall Jackson, up to that point. So he wasn't going in with his best leaders, and the situation just kept spinning out of control as a result of that. But he did have an opportunity to win that battle on the second day and thus win the entire war. And if his troops had gotten to Little Round Top just a few minutes earlier, the Confederates probably would have won that war if they'd gotten there before the Union forces had gotten to the top of those hills. The show was right about the importance of intelligence and the importance of spies. They did get that right, particularly in Vietnam. The Vietnamese intelligence network was very good because they would have their women set up as girlfriends for the American GIs, and when these guys were moving from unit to unit or place to place, they would tell their girlfriends that, were spies, and they would tell their handlers, and then they knew where the Americans were moving to. So the Vietnamese had very good intelligence in that, and they did actually follow the precepts of Sun Tzu's The Art of War very well in that. One of the things I'd like to talk about also is, I'd like to say about the people doing that show from the History Channel. I mean, these guys, overall, they did a pretty good job on the show, but they're not actual, they're not actual, I'm guessing they're not actual military men, and they haven't probably seen combat, and it's, kind of like armchair quarterbacks, to some extent, saying they should have done this way, they should have done it that way, it would have worked. I mean, even very gifted generals like Napoleon can have bad days at like Waterloo. Okay. Yeah, I'd like to talk for a moment about the Battle of Waterloo. It was interesting because Napoleon, he actually split up his forces right before that battle. He gave Grouchy a third of his force to follow the Prussians. That turned out to be a huge mistake because he should have kept his forces together. If he kept his forces together when he met Wellington at Waterloo, he probably would have won the battle because he had enough guys to have overwhelmed him. But even in not doing that, Grouchy made the mistake of not being quick enough when he heard the guns to send his forces to back up Napoleon. There's a saying in warfare, always go towards the sounds of the guns. The sound of the guns is true. If you're fighting going on somewhere, you want to go towards where that fighting is and get in on it. And Grouchy didn't do that. He was mad at Napoleon. Let his personal feelings affect his better judgment. The thing is also, the Battle of Waterloo, it's interesting because Napoleon sent in troops to the right flank that started pushing that right flank, and that flank started to give where the farmhouse was at, and what he should have done was just continue to support that movement, and I think if he would have done that, he would have, he probably would have won that battle. And even throwing in his immortals and his best troops in that, it's like what Genghis Khan used to do. He'd form up a line and start fighting, and whatever point started giving, he would throw everything into that point that started giving until it just kept giving and giving and giving, and he would rout the enemy. And that was a tactic that worked for him every single time without exception. And let's not forget, Genghis, once he got rolling and became a world conqueror, once he got the Mongols united and started rolling, he never lost a battle, his entire career as a warlord. And it's interesting because I don't think his kids, some of them I don't think lost a battle either, actually, under him when they were fighting. So I'd like to talk for a moment about mistakes of World War II. Some of the mistakes of World War II, it's interesting because the Germans were basically, they were a third-rate army fighting 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th-rate armies. And because of that, they thought they were actually a first-rate army defeating second and third-rate armies. But the truth of the matter was they really weren't near as good as what they thought they were and the rest of the world thought they were. One of the mistakes that they made was they started the World War too early before they had really developed up their military power, their military forces to a much greater extent. Their fascist leader, El Duce, Mussolini, he wanted to wait till 1945 to start World War II, to where both of them had properly built up enough military forces to win this. And that's one of the few times that Mussolini was right and Hitler was actually wrong, but events seemed to conspire against him. Things, started spinning out of control. Also was the fact that they won several easy victories early on, and they thought that this pattern would just continue. And when they got to Russia, it didn't. And when they got to Russia, it was a case of a third-rate army going up against another third-rate army. And it didn't take the Russians long to become a second-rate army, then a first-rate one, and then squash them. But one of the huge mistakes that the Germans made was they underestimated the Russians and they overestimated their own capabilities. Another huge fault they had was they didn't develop very good tanks early in the war, and everyone was trying to play catch up on that in World War II. Not just the Germans, the Russians, the Americans, the Italians. Everybody was trying to catch up with that. It's interesting because by the end of the war, you look at the tanks at the beginning of World War II. At the end, it was only about 5 years the difference, but they made quantum leaps in advancements in that time in terms of tanks and tank destroyers. One of the mistakes that Hitler made was at the Battle of Crete. He committed a lot of airborne forces. He won the Battle of Crete, but then he just abandoned the island after he won the battle there, and then the British just like 8 months later peacefully reoccupied the island of Crete and used it as an air base. He should have left some like Italian troops on there to try and hold that island, particularly after he paid such a heavy price taking it. Also, he should have landed those paratroopers at Malta instead of at Crete, and taken that island, because that was a base of operations that they could hammer from. Another mistake they made was those paratroopers they landed at Crete. Crete could have also been landed at Gibraltar and taken that island from the British, because Malta and Gibraltar were the two bases that they were operating from, and Hitler didn't land troops there to defeat them. They made, a huge number of mistakes made on both sides during that war. The Battle of Sicily, Patton's plan was actually a very good one, and they should have stuck with Patton's plan. But Monty didn't want to do it because his ego didn't want to be the second one into Messina. He wanted to be the first one in there, matter of his own personal prestige. So that was a case of Monty should have been a team player on that and gone along with Patton's plan. If I was in that position, Montgomery's position, I would have, and I'm sure Patton would have appreciated that. Other mistakes that were made, it's Battle of Normandy, the Germans. Hitler stripped too much command from his officers in the field. That was a huge mistake on his part. It's interesting because he was a dictatorship, and you'd think his command structure would be more efficient than a democracy and a republic like American England, but actually the exact opposite was true. That was a huge mistake on his part. Rommel had a good plan for defeating the Allied invasion. And also, one of his other generals, he wanted to have a massive panzer reserve, allow the Allies to land wherever they did, and then hit them with that panzer reserve. And what happened was they decided not to. Hitler just compromised on both plans, and in the end it had all the bad points of both plans with none of the good points of either of them. So that was another huge mistake. Another mistake was the invasion of Russia. They botched that one very badly. They didn't get to. They probably would have been better to have waited until the next spring to invade Russia. And that's because they invaded too late in the fall, and that probably cost them the war. Another huge mistake was at the Battle of Stalingrad. Hitler wanted to bypass Stalingrad and go for the oil fields, and his generals didn't want to do that. There's one time where Hitler was right and his generals were wrong. They should have just bypassed Stalingrad and gone right to the oil fields. Another mistake that they made was, they tried to have long-range torpedo boats around England later in the war, If they had done that earlier in the war, they probably could have choked off England, and then they wouldn't have even needed to have invaded it. They could have just starved England to death once they cut off their supply lines and supplies of fuel and munitions. That was another mistake. They hadn't built up their navies strong enough. One of their admirals said about World War II, he said about all we can do, about once the war started, their navy wasn't near to being ready. He said about all we can do is die bravely. That was pretty much what happened. A lot of mistakes made on both sides of the war, particularly at Normandy. Hitler not giving enough freedom to his officers, not allowing them to release their tank troops and their other troops, except on his direct orders, whereas they should have been allowed to at least have control over their own units. And they should have had like an overall German commander separate from Hitler, who could give the authority, like Eisenhower, who could make decisions in the field in real time without having to ask Hitler's permission on it. He was over micromanaging his forces to disastrous results. The thing was if they had the Panzer Reserve, that probably would have worked. Let them land and then just hit them in force with their tanks, then push them back. Another mistake they made was, like I said, they should have pushed hard. When they're invading Russia, once they decided to do that, they should have pushed harder to get to Moscow. I know that's easier said than done in retrospect, but if they had taken Moscow, the Japanese actually would have landed their forces on the other side of the Soviet Union and invaded that point. Once they felt that Moscow was in the Germans' hands, they felt it was pretty much just over for the Russians at that point. So they would have brought the Japanese into the war if they'd taken Moscow. It was, there were a lot of battles, like the Battle of Kursk. The Germans botched that very badly. Also, the Germans should have engaged once they were on the defensive. They should have tried to do more of a defensive, offensive strategy, set up a defensive line, let the enemy hit it, use the terrain to your advantage, and then pull back to another good defensive line, let the enemy hit it, then pull back. That's a strategy that we used in Korea when we were fighting the Chinese, where we gave up territory and just grinded them down slowly. Then when they were in a weakened state, counterattacked them and pushed them back. That was a strategy that would have worked for the Germans at least better than what they had. But the whole thing was just a mess. It's like the invasion of Normandy. When you're landing a force on beaches, you're trying to build up enough men and personnel to establish a bridgehead there and then push forward. And what the enemy's trying to do is establish enough forces to push you back to the ocean before you can be able to get a foothold on, and then from that foothold push them back. So it's a matter of both sides trying to get up enough troops and men and equipment quickly to do that. But because Hitler was holding back the Panzer, he held back a lot of his tank reserves for a week before he released them at Normandy, and that was a huge mistake on his part. You have to understand something. Every day at Normandy, the Allies could only land 4 divisions. Germans had about 2 divisions on the beaches of Normandy, and some other divisions in reserve. They had about 30 divisions in reserve in Europe that they could launch at Normandy, and they were slow at moving these divisions up to push them back. Now you have to understand something. The first day, they could land only 4 divisions by sea, and then another 3.5 by air. They landed the 6th Division by air, the 101st and 82nd by air, and about a half a division of men by gliders. So they had landed about 3.5. So that was about 7.5 divisions that they landed on the first day. Now, if they could quickly move up more divisions, you see what I'm saying, to that they could have quickly pushed us back into the ocean. Also, we landed at the strongest points that they were at, where they had dug in on those beaches, where if we landed on the Normandy Peninsula and just left of where they had dug in and a little bit right, a lot of those areas were very lightly defended, and that's where we should have been landing our troops at. But to some extent, I mean, we kind of had to land the British troops at Caen, south of that, because we needed to take Caen. We need to push in from that, and we're kind of stuck on that one. We didn't have much of a choice landing there. But basically, we got lucky. Our paratroopers took out a lot of the artillery in their rear. It was zeroed in on our troops, and we were able to storm the fortified positions that they had set up for us. So we really got lucky at Normandy. Our chances of winning that were not very good the way we landed there, but we didn't have very many good choices either, in all fairness to the planners. But we should have also landed basically another 3 divisions by air the second day, or by glider. We really needed to get as many men and material ashore as we could, and particularly their rear. And even if they captured a lot of these guys, it's like what Julius Caesar said: whenever we make a prisoner of one of the enemy soldiers, they make a prisoner of 2 of ours. So that's manpower and resources, grabbing it, even if they did capture these guys, grabbing up these guys and moving them back to the rear. That's resources that they're not using for repulsing the invasion. So it was basically, the Allies blundered that invasion very badly. The Germans blundered it both very badly. We had our airplanes go straight like this towards the beaches, and then they didn't want to hit the ships, so they gave them a couple seconds before they dropped their bombs. So their bombs missed their targets. If they went across the beaches like this in a straight line and landed them, and they should have just said to the ships, you're just going to have to take your chances on getting hit or not with a bomb. That's war. But these were contact bombs that they were dropping, and they would have done some damage to the ships, but not a huge amount, not as much as a bomb that's designed to go, a delayed action bomb that's designed to go through the hull of the ship. At any rate, there were a huge number of mistakes made. It's interesting because I played a simulator for the Normandy landings, and I was able to do it the way I wanted to do it, as opposed to the way they actually did it. And I was able to take Normandy much faster, and with far fewer losses than what they actually had happen. It's interesting because another thing I wanted to talk to about Lee at Lee at Gettysburg. People said that he should have marched away from Gettysburg and forced the Union Army to follow him. The problem with that was, if he marched towards Washington, D.C., Washington, D.C. was one of the most heavily defended cities in the world at that time, probably the most heavily defended. Heavy artillery there, their own militia troops that they could quickly mobilize, dug in around that area. And plus, DC's not an easy area to approach, to attack, because they got swamps there. There's only so many avenues that they could approach at. If Lee had marched at Washington, D.C., and I was a Union commander, I would have been delighted. I would have let him march to that city. I could have evacuated the President, Congress, and the Supreme Court and moved him up to New York City, and then it just becomes another city on the coast at that point. I would have let him hit Washington, D.C., and what I would have done was I would slowly brought up my forces to follow them, and then I would have tried to move south to cut off their escape back to the south, and then hit them from the hit them, hit their flank, where they're caught between my forces and the defenders of Washington D.C. and they'd be pinned between that and the swamps, and basically have them trapped at that point. I wouldn't even have to. I could just dig in at that point and starve them out, I mean, or I could close with them and finish them off. That would have been an ideal scenario for the Union forces if they actually allowed Lee, had the guts to allow him to get that far. But Lee, I figured, was smart enough to know that. That's why he didn't head for Washington, D.C. He knows he could have been trapped between two forces and annihilated. So that was another mistake they talked about in the show, Sun Tzu, The Art of War, saying that he ignored Sun Tzu's tactics to his own detriment. But the thing was, it was a guideline that doesn't fit every scenario. That's one scenario where that wouldn't have actually worked. So, it's interesting because, the Japanese, another mistake from World War II, the Japanese, they didn't have, a mistake that cost them the war was they had combat engineers on the island of Guadalcanal, but they didn't give them any infantry, and they didn't even give them any small arms. These guys were building the airfields, that was a huge mistake on their part. They should have given them infantry support and artillery support while they were building that field, just in case the Allies landed. If they had, if the Japanese had gotten those airfields going, they would have won that war, or at least won it well enough to where we would have sued for peace at that point, and just let them have whatever territory that they were holding on to. So there's a huge number of mistakes made. You look at the Battle of Pearl Harbor. The Japanese should have took out our fuel facilities when they attacked. They didn't bother to do that. They should have taken out our dry docks too. They didn't bother to do that. These were big mistakes that they made that they later really grew to regret, because we were able to very quickly fix most of our ships that were damaged in the attack of Pearl Harbor and get them back out in the ocean within about 6 months. So at any rate, those are my comments. I hope you enjoyed them, and if you like what you see, feel free to hit subscribe. Okay, thanks. Jason, where's the off button on that?
You can just hit stop.
Stop?
So, yeah, hit the red button so it stops recording, and then shut the LCD screen. It'll automatically